on land for rural housing earlier this year and developed a couple of proposals which we think would really help increase the delivery of housing in rural Scotland. And the reason that our board decided to carry out further research in this area is really the outstanding demand for rural housing. So one big factor is we know that renewables and other economic growth opportunities could really lead to good jobs and to an increase of population in rural areas. A couple of relevant studies are expected to be published in the next month. Highlands and Islands Enterprise have carried out a scoping study looking at the scale of the investment that's coming to the Highlands and Islands and also the clusters where most of the investment will go. And they estimate that at a maximum, there'll be over 100 billion invested over the next 10 years. That's a huge figure, but of course you need the infrastructure, including housing, to support that. And a second relevant study is coming from South of Scotland Enterprise, and it's looking at need and demand for key worker housing, but also the impact that a lack of affordable housing of all tenures can have on employers and employees. The second major issue that led us to carrying out this research is the challenge of rural depopulation in some rural and remote areas. The Scottish Government has developed an action plan to look at this, and really the challenge is both about loss of population, but also an ageing demographic that makes it harder for communities to be sustainable and successful. And of course, any action plan to address this really has to look at providing enough long-term affordable housing to actually allow people of working age to come to these communities. A big challenge we found in our previous work on land for housing is that the volume house building model, which essentially builds around 90% of Scotland's homes, doesn't really work in much of rural Scotland. This picture is from a development in East Lothian, which is rural, and there are also developments in places in the inner Moray Firth, close to Inverness. But really, these are the exception, and the reason volume builders work there is they're close to vibrant market areas that are really connected to cities. But on the whole, there's market failure. And that means that if rural homes are to be delivered, a different approach to land and development needs to be taken. Our research has found that this is a challenge, but also I think it's fair to say that it provides certain opportunities. So I won't read this out, I'm just really summarising the context that I wanted to provide before Anna and Andrew speak to you. We looked previously at the role of public interest-led development and community-led housing in a previous webinar and addressing this challenge in delivering rural housing. And today I'm delighted that we're going to look at another key sector in landowner-led development. So thank you very much for attending today. I'll not take up any more of your time, and I'll now hand over to Anna Gardiner of Scottish Land and Estates, who's going to give you a presentation.
Okay. Yeah, some points that I think are important to understand, which will help put the delivery of rural housing into context. I have basically in this, I'm going to give an overview of three contrasting models for housing delivery. One in the deep Scottish borders, one in the rugged north of the Isle of Mull, and finally one on the bonny banks of Loch Lomond. The rural economy is wholly dependent on there being sort of adequate worker housing nearby. Today, it is known that the largest barrier to recruitment and retention of workers in Scotland is a shortage of local housing. However, it would be remiss of me not to add that the ever-declining provision of local public services is also a contributing factor to rural depopulation. We're talking about things like nurseries, local bus services, that sort of stuff, the things that everyday life just is made easier by having nearby. The local authorities justify the absence of services on low population and therefore low use, but they don't really take account of the fact that that's actually a driver of the depopulation. So it's a kind of chicken and egg situation. And for rural areas to thrive, they need housing and services. The two are not really mutually exclusive. Isolated industries built their own communities, which often included many of the local services that are today taken for granted in more accessible locations. Cottages were built for coal miners, for workers in the textile industry, for agricultural labourers and forestry workers, just to name a few. However, as industrialisation and globalisation has reduced the workforce in the traditional industries, much of that housing has been sold over the years, while the remaining proportion, that which has not been retained as tied accommodation for employees, makes up the rural private rented sector. The economy has evolved, and the growth of other sources of employment means that housing is still in demand, but the limited supply of social housing and the constrained supply of private rented housing means that the options are few. Today, the price of housing for sale is often far out of reach of many rural workers, with prices inflated by the growth of the second home market and, of course, retirees seeking a little bit of the good life. The economy has always been dependent on the private sector industries providing rural housing, and this is no different today. Yet this is now juxtaposed against the economics of providing such housing, which is very different to what it was 100 years ago. The absence of a ready supply of conveniently located housing means that the private sector typically develops housing out of necessity, be that to support their own workforce or that in the wider community. So what has emerged over the years is an approach that takes many forms, but it helps spread the risk and enable housing where often asset-rich, cash-poor landowners might otherwise not be able to. It is a partnership model, but I use this in quite loose terms because it's rare to come across a partnership that mirrors one that's gone before. So the first example we're going to look at is Leat Hoch in Coldstream, down in the southeast of the Scottish borders. Douglas and Angus Estates own the Hersal estate outside Coldstream. And today the Douglas-Hume family run the estate as a commercial enterprise with forestry, agriculture and renewable energy as their main income streams. Where the past saw the estate building homes to house employees of their enterprises, more recently it's been responding to other local housing needs. And that meant in the not so distant past, it was by selling land to developers to build. But in more recent times, the developers have simply not been interested in rural sites. So their fortune here was that they went into partnership, a joint venture with a local one-man band developer, Jamie Hudson. And this came about from a shared passion, really, to develop housing that would generate an outcome that was much more fitting with the local community and environment. And the total collapse of the housing market after the 2008 financial crash set the landscape for this change of approach, because the low margin rural developments became a complete no-go area for the general house builders. So the Leat Hoch site that was already allocated was essentially doomed to sit barren indefinitely. So Hudson Hersal, that was the brand that they developed, took up the gauntlet to address the need for the local housing with the aim for providing good quality housing that met the vernacular of the area, but at an affordable price. And that approach and degree of engagement undertaken locally, it meant that when they were developing the plans, they had absolutely no resistance from the local community. Layout included courtyards, village greens, mews, and traditional on-street properties with rear car parking. The house styles vary from detached houses, semi-detached houses, terraces, and a courtyard with a range of 2 to 4 bedrooms. The development integrates on-street affordable housing using shared ownership tenure, with further off-site mid-market rental housing being built on a nearby redundant farmsteading. And that was financed by the profits of the sale on the main development. Hudson Housel have managed the financial challenges from the outset. I mean, the primary challenge was how to raise capital as cheaply as possible to ensure viability. The advantage of the estate's size meant it did not need to rely on expensive short-term developer finance, and the finance could be raised using owned farmland as collateral. However, cash flow challenges started before the turf was even cut, with a 6-figure sum demanded by Scottish Borders Council as a roads bond. And the developer contributions also pushed viability to its limits, leaving very little contingency. Ultimately, the wider economic landscape has created a perfect storm due to the growth constraints of the house price values in the Scottish Borders, which have not kept up with increasing development costs. The costs, excluding land, have increased by 63%, leaving a 16% shortfall. As a consequence, the build has stalled, pending the market rebalance. The partnership, it brought together the will to develop and the ability to raise finance with important developer expertise. And the recent economic climate is an unfortunate frustration, but it should not be allowed to cloud what this partnership has already achieved in terms of the number of mixed tenure units completed in a marginal location and without a penny of public funding. Farm on Mull. Glengorm Estate extends over much of the northern part of the Isle of Mull. Its primary income is agriculture, but the Nelson family have, over the past few decades, increasingly diversified the business into tourism. This development of home farm came about from a combination of factors. The old farmsteading was essentially redundant apart from an existing cottage. It was underutilised, unsuitable for modern agriculture. There was a shortage of housing on Mull, and as a result, the estate and other local businesses were struggling to recruit the workers they needed to employ to grow their own businesses. And the owner was determined that converting the steading into long-term housing was the obvious solution. But he had 2 problems. The first was a lack of capital, and the second was the how-to, or the know-how. The partnership here came about by hooking up with Mull and Iona Community Development Trust, who were able to provide the necessary support to assist with the production of a feasibility study to support the applications for planning and grant funding. Ultimately, this feasibility study was simply to prove the demand so that the Rural and Islands Housing Fund grant could be secured. There were 77 expressions of interest submitted for a development that could only generate 5 units. The development involved stripping out the building to a shell, creating a timber-framed, highly efficient construction within the 2-foot thick stone walls, all for the princely sum of £1.1 million. So it was still a massive investment. The primary challenge was not so much the slowdown of activity through COVID, but actually the changing economic climate mid-build. This going back to the Rural and Islands Housing Fund cap in hand, as well as having to deal with the volatile high interest rates on the loan taken out for the balancing cost of the bill. And this is a double-edged sword because the condition of getting the government grant that enabled the build meant that the rents were tied to the local affordable rent, and no rent adjustment could be made to help offset even a little bit of the significant increase in interest payments on the loan. And so until such time that interest rates settle back, the estate is paying an annual 5-figure sum to provide the housing. So they're not taking any income from it. It's actually, they're essentially paying for what they have provided. While they're pragmatic about it, seeing it as a necessary evil because of the benefit they're gaining through the provision of the housing, they've said that they wouldn't be prepared to do the same again unless the terms of the grant change, because it just simply puts too much risk on them. This partner's still been a success in so much it's provided the housing and quickly, but the process has exposed flaws in the government funding system, without which such remote rural development by the private sector would not be possible. So there is improvement that could come in that, especially in such challenging economic times where viability is such a big issue. The final example I'm going to just touch on is over on the west side of Loch Lomond at Luss Estate. So the Luss Strategic Development Framework was published back in 2013 by Luss Estates, and this was to investigate the declining population in West Loch Lomond. It set out the objective to reverse the population ageing and decline in Luss Parish. The estate worked with the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, who are the local planning authority, on a Section 75 planning agreement to enable them to unlock other key developments that would help the area cope better with the influx of visitors in the summer months. The Section 75 compelled Luss Estate to deliver 5 affordable homes for rent, as well as taking back control of and developing the village green and play park that had seen years of underinvestment by the local authority. The estate approached Link Housing Association, who they already had a close working relationship with because they'd given several village cottages to them back in the 1990s. The land for the new housing was transferred for the princely sum of £1. However, to overcome an impasse with the local planning authority over the style of the build, the estate actually had to fork out another £80,000 just to see the house delivered without further delay. Understanding this approach where you're sort of paying to provide housing, it might be sort of hard for anyone who's much more used to the economics of volume house builders and their focus on the profit margin. But as with the Glengormley example, the difference is a whole estate approach, and it accounts for the impact of the lack of affordable housing on the community and its services. It's a real needs must attitude. More recently, Luss Estate has supported the development of Luss and Arden Local Place Plan, which was published by the local community council. And the estate's next 10-year strategic plan was published in 2024 with that local place plan front and centre. Come of a significant stakeholder engagement for both documents, I identified that the supply of affordable housing remains an absolute primary need to sustain the community and address the ageing profile and population. In response to this, the estate has approached the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park Authority to follow the same model as before, essentially the estate gifting the land to enable the delivery of 6 affordable homes by Links Housing Association, coupled with more public realm activities that the estate would basically take on where local public service had fallen away. But there are 2 new issues that are currently presenting insurmountable barriers to the much needed new housing being brought forward. Firstly, is less certainty over whether Links Housing Association will be able to secure the funding from the government for the new housing. And second, the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park are unwilling to engage because they say that the new planning framework, MPF4, won't support the previous model. So a solution was proposed in that a master plan consent area could be brought forward, but the park's unwilling to do this in a national scenic area. So the remaining route is via cumbersome, uncertain, and usually pretty slow method of getting sites allocated in the next call for sites or costly speculative planning applications. And to compound matters, these processes make it very hard to dovetail the process with any funding made available to Links Housing Association for the build. So really, in terms of landowner-led provision of housing in the national park, the ability to enable housing has gone from difficult to near impossible. And it's very frustrating to see that when the previous model was so successful. Moreover, in terms of viability today, it's probably worth pointing out that the small-scale development is particularly expensive to bring forward. And so there's a further barrier in the national park. They won't approve anything that's larger than small-scale development. So there's real economies of scale challenges to be overcome there. So the difficulty that the state has is they sort of see the success of the Bendu View development now being impossible to replicate. So they are back to the drawing board. So I've given a small insight into how some landowners have developed rural housing in recent years. And the common thread is that a partnership model in some form is a key enabler. It spreads risk, it can open doors to extra finance and additional expertise. And of course, everyone is pushing in the same direction with the ultimate goal of getting the housing delivered and quickly. And there is no doubt that the private sector performs best when it comes to delivery times for new housing. However, I've also shown that there is a third party that is a really key enabler in every development, and that is the public sector. The public sector has got this unique opportunity to unlock rural housing development by providing essential support through agile planning, more appealing grant terms, and fairer development levies. And with the right approach, they can promote growth and investment in rural housing. Landowners are eager to contribute, and the public sector really holds the key to making that happen. So I hope that's given you a bit of an overview of all the different ways that can be utilised to bring forward rural housing. There's definitely an appetite to do it. So it's just a matter of finding the right recipe to get that really good outcome. So thank you very much. And let's see if I can unshare my screen.
Can everybody see that? Hopefully you can. Okay, well, Anna's given you a sort of broad view of the delivery of housing by landowners. I'm going to focus on one particular project. And I'll say right from the start that Torna Grain's an unusual project by dint of its scale. But I hope to be able to show that some of the lessons that we've learned are probably applicable to other smaller projects as well. And I hope to pick up a few of the themes that Anna identified. I'm going to give you, I mean, it's a very large project and 15 minutes is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of it. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time telling you about Torna Grain itself, but you'll be able to find further information about that on our website. But I'm going to have a look at why we're doing it, how we're doing it, what challenges we've experienced, what benefits we think there have been from the approach that we've taken in delivering it ourselves, what policy changes could potentially help other landowners looking to develop housing or projects directly, and what lessons there are for smaller projects. So quickly, in terms of context, the idea for Torna Grain, which is a new standalone community between Inverness and Nairn, actually came from an evolved plan from Highland Council, who were exploring how to best accommodate the growth of the Inverness and Nairn area. And I suppose to answer the obvious question, why a new settlement and not further expansion of Nairn and Inverness? Inverness in particular is geographically constrained by water and hills, and that was leaving the eastward corridor towards Nairn as the obvious location for development. And to some extent, a new community provided a better opportunity for sort of planning afresh rather than the urban sprawl model, which has rather predominated growth in the last several decades. The estate had to give a great deal of thought to what we wanted to see, or what we hope to see, but we also wanted to involve the community. So this is an image from the Charette, which is a community design program project that we ran in 2006, which ran for 2 weeks and involved 600 members of the local community and helped to develop the master plan, which was ultimately submitted for planning in early 2009. And that's the plan. The A96 is running along the north side of the site. This is a business park project, and the airport is top left of the screen to help you identify where we are. A few metrics about the site. I did say that it's quite a large site, 600 acres. The planning permission that we received in late 2013, so if we just think about that, that's longer than it took to fight the Second World War, is for just under 5,000 homes, of which we've built 400 already. 25% of those will be affordable across the various affordable tenures. 200,000 square feet of retail, which was really sized against other market towns of a similar size, like Nairn and Forres. Employment space, there is an additional business park project which the estate's involved in as well, so there'll be more employment space in there. Schools, first one will open in 2027. There's already a rail station, health centre next year, and pretty much everything else you'd expect in a market town, which will have a population of about 13,000 people. And there we are in a bit more detail, context of the Tornagrain master plan in the wider A96 corridor plan as developed by the council. So what have we built so far? This is just to give you a flavour that not all development has to look like most development. And also key are that there are commercial properties already, non-residential properties in the town. It's an important part of what we're trying to do, that the facilities that towns need are there. So that's the general store. There's a pharmacy already. You're getting a flavour of the architectural style as well. I'm not going to spend too long on these. This is just to give you a flavour. That's the outdoor nursery, and obviously the allotments in front. They've been a good driver of community building, because it gives people something that they can be involved in, and they can build social relations because they happen to be digging their allotment next door to somebody doing theirs. And of course, it's all about happy people. So, I mean, the bulk of what I wanted to talk about today is the why, the how, the challenges, etc. Why is the estate doing it? Well, profit's the intention. I mean, this is a commercial enterprise, so we're not doing this for altruistic reasons, and we view profit as, you know, the most important driver in some respect, because that's genuine sustainability. It's very difficult to drive things forward if there isn't actually some profit to be made at the end of it. But we wanted to do it the way we're doing it because we wanted to avoid detriment to the retained land holdings. The Tornagrain project's in the middle of the Castle Stewart estate, and we didn't want a large-scale development which we felt was not of benefit to the wider land holdings that we had. We did want to see a project that both we and the community, or the future community, would be proud of, so that was an important driver. But as I've said at the bottom, this isn't about legacy. This isn't an ego thing that we wanted to develop something that just happened to be better than everybody else's. The quality is an important part of what we're doing, but it isn't about a sort of legacy thing. We were to achieve our aspirations, we were clear that we needed to have control over the project because it was going to be extremely difficult to do that, we felt, if we had to take on board a developer partner at the outset, because that would inevitably water down the control you have over the project. The estate had some previous experience that it could draw on. The estate built part of the Edinburgh New Town, so that's the sort of Moray Place, Randolph Crescent, Ainslie Place section of the new town, which was obviously a success. But it was also involved in the development, or the initial development, of Dalgety Bay, which is a new town in Fife, which is very much of its time, and it's not without its successes. But both of those projects, even though they were historic, provided some lessons for the estate to build on in taking forward the Torna Grain project. How we did it, like the Douglas and Angus estates, we've got a wider business which provided some free cash flow. We were also able to borrow cheaply with our existing banks using agricultural rates, because we could secure the debt that we needed against the rest of our assets, and renewables and other things that have been developing part of our business assisted with the capacity to fund this. We made all the key consultant appointments, so again we were in control of the process, and we made the key design appointments as well, so that, you know, what we were trying, our evolving vision was something that we could develop alongside those designers. A key issue for us actually early in the process was to work out what the town would be like, and I've used that expression carefully, not what it would necessarily look like, but what the town would be like. So although Torna Grain, we hope people like immediately what they see when they get there in terms of architecture and styling, etc. Actually, most of the work is about the master plan and the mix of uses and all the things that are necessary to create a community. And it's very important not to get sort of too fixated on architecture. It's about the structure of the town and the way it works, which is critical. I've already mentioned the community design process. So involving the surrounding communities in the development of the project was an important part, we felt, of embedding it in the local area. We prepared our own planning application, the environmental impact assessment, etc. I've already mentioned that took about 4.5 years to go through the planning process. But in terms of delivery, it's built by third-party housing developers. Although we are and have just lodged a planning application for a part of the development that we will build ourselves. So we're planning to sort of deepen our involvement in the project by becoming a house builder. Looking at the challenges, well, the obvious ones are money. The planning and design process is eye-wateringly expensive. Initial infrastructure, because we were having to prepare the site so that the house builders could start, was also expensive. We worked closely with Scottish Water for several years to develop a strategic foul water and potable water strategy. I'll come back to that funding agreement, but essentially we delivered it for Scottish Water and they bought it from us at day one, which was a critical part of enabling us to get on site. And then we had some additional infrastructure that needed to be funded to get on site for the second phase of the project. Time is a major challenge with these projects. It takes an enormous, it takes a long time to go through planning and all the rest of the stages that you need to go through. That was 10 years in our case. And you have, to quote Mr. Rumsfeld, the known unknowns, things like the electricity grid and will there be sufficient capacity, the pace and the costs of the decarbonisation agenda. And then we've also got all the unknown unknowns, which are just a function of a 50-year time horizon project. I mean, things that will happen that we're going to have to deal with that we just can't know at this stage. The benefits of doing it the way that we do it, as we see it, we think that the charrette and engaging with the communities during local communities during the planning process was pretty important to the low level of resistance the project saw. We had 50 letters of objection to greenfield site, new project of 5,000 homes. And I think that's a testament to the benefits of engaging community through the right through the planning process. We're pleased with the quality of place that we're creating, and we think that that's basically because we've been able to control the process and we're using a different development model than the norm. Our engagement, we believe, allows us to sort of curate that community by having a deeper involvement than simply designing it and selling blocks off for sale. So, for instance, we retain the commercial properties because that allows us to target certain occupiers, offer incentives for the right occupiers, etc. We drive the delivery of social and community infrastructure. It might be something simple like allotments or tennis courts. There's already a community hall. And we're also the factoring company so that we can ensure a cost-effective delivery of high-quality open space and public realm to help the community feel at home. There's quite a stringent deed of conditions associated with the project, which limits what people can do or what they can change. And that's governed by the Torna Grain Conservation Trust. There was a parliamentary order granted to create a conservation zone for Torna grain. And that's governed by the estate, the local authority and the community together. And by the time we're halfway through the project, the community will be in charge of that conservation trust, so the community themselves will control their own destiny. We see benefits in long-term value for us. We think we're building value over the piece, and because we own the whole site, we'll be able to enjoy that. And we are retaining this long-term interest in the project, both by keeping the non-residential properties, but also, if it's a success, also being one of the house builders. So David asked me to think about, well, what policy changes might help. A few thoughts. We see no benefits in the planning system, the RCC system, or anything else from having a high quality master plan, which took a lot of design and time. We have to go through the same process, and to some extent we probably go through more process than others, because every time we bring forward an application it's different, so we don't get the benefit of the precedent set by the cookie cutter approach. The uncertainty and expense of the planning system's probably killing smaller developers. We've heard that the larger volume builders aren't interested in rural areas, and yet we've created a system that actually perversely aids the volume builders, because they're the only ones with the capital and the appetite to enable them to go through the planning process. Environmental impact assessments, in my view, are often excessive, and they're almost always out of date for large projects by the time you get to the point of use. So a slimmed down version of that's probably necessary. We've already heard about the problems of NPF4, but I think society as a whole needs to have a discussion about the trade-off between homes versus the environment versus community agency, because you might have to make compromises in all those and work out which it is that in certain areas you consider most important. The decarbonisation agenda is very expensive, and that is going to damage the viability of a lot of projects, particularly when in conjunction with general build cost inflation. And government, I think, needs to understand the cost of high quality placemaking. One area where I think government can provide some assistance is if they can find a way of helping with the early stages of projects like Torna grain, or even smaller ones. Then that will help, because that's the high risk stage. That's when the cost of finance is expensive and a lot of chances are being taken. That's the most difficult thing for the private sector to fund. So if the government can help with that early stage mitigation, then that would be a big assistance. We had a very good example at Torna grain, which I've mentioned already, which was the partnership that we reached with Scottish Water to develop the strategic solution for foul and potable water, which really enabled the project to go ahead. Scottish Water will recover all that investment during the course of the project, but that front funding was vital. Lessons for smaller projects. Make sure you've got a clear development finance model ready, so that you know that you've got a project that can work before you commit too much capital. That gets more difficult, obviously, the longer the project term. Learn to assume that all costs will arrive on time, but the income will arrive late, because that has quite an impact on your cash flow. Anna's already picked up on the importance of local authorities. Building alliances with them is vital, because they're so important to the whole process. Resist spending on things that you just don't think are necessary, because there is a lot of asks from local authorities who haven't got the funds to deliver stuff to get you to deliver it as a developer. And you're going to need patience, resilience, imagination, and, as I've said there, a large swear box. So I'll finish with a pretty picture.